Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Bill Roach, and this is another episode of Timeless Dialogues, where we discuss issues related to theology, philosophy, apologetics, and politics, that fun, wonderful discipline. And what we're going to do today is we're going to discuss the top books in philosophy that you should read. Now, let me give you a really classic example of what typically goes on with people. They walk into a bookstore, they walk into a library, and they go to the philosophy section. Maybe you have pressing questions that you're wanting to figure out, and you look on the shelves, you start thinking to yourself, oh my goodness, where do I even start? Which book should I read? Which era should I read? How do I know if I even agree with the guy or not? Well, if that is you, sit right there, and I'm going to give you the top books that you should read in the history of philosophy. Now, before we do, I need your help. I need you to help me by subscribing to this channel so that we can continue to make content like this. This really just helps me know what you enjoy, what you're looking for, and it also helps get these videos out to a broader audience. So if you could please like and subscribe to this channel and forward it on to your friends. This is going to help all of us as we continue our timeless dialogues on these issues related to philosophy. So here's a big issue that we run into, and this is probably my key advice before we jump into this topic. Like anything, there are primary sources, secondary sources, a variety of different sources that you can look at. And I would recommend that you spend most of your time looking at the primary sources of the main figures of any discipline. You're going to cover the most ground that way, and you're going to be discussing the pertinent texts related to the key authors in order to discuss the real questions of the history of philosophy. Because what happens is some people read all this secondary literature by their favorite contemporary philosopher. It's not really dealing with the big issues in the history of philosophy. And unfortunately, they waste a lot of time and they're not dealing with the big issues that philosophy tries to look at, which is a conversation for another video. Now, as we're going through this, I just want to make one little plug for a video series that I did titled Footnotes on Plato. And it's a very brief history of philosophy course in like 5 or 6 lectures where I deal with each of these key figures very briefly so you can get the flow of ideas, understand the key issues, the key ideas in order to equip you to study the history of philosophy. With that aside, we're going to jump into 2 big series as we look into these books. The first one is you have this series titled A History of Philosophy by Frederick Copleston. And what Copleston's trying to do here is provide probably the best series on the history of philosophy for students so they can understand who these figures are, what their key works are, what types of questions are they asking, what types of questions are they responding to. And he put this together in his multi-volume 9-work series in which he lays out everything from the pre-Socratics up until the time of his death, which was probably in the 20th century, right in there. And it's probably the most up-to-date work that you can find covering the full scope of literature. And I would recommend that you go and buy it, the full 9-volume series by Frederick Copleston. Now, the reason that's important is because there's 2 primary ways that you can study the history of philosophy, the right way and the wrong way, laying my cards out on the table. One is by studying the history of philosophy, understanding where philosophy came from, how the conversation took place, who the detractors were. You can understand the narrative flow of the history of philosophy, reading the key works, reading the primary sources, and seeing how the conversation unfolded. The other way, to quote my favorite living philosopher today, namely Peter Crave, is the analytic approach, where you just study issues apart from maybe who said it, when they said it, why they said it, the context of it. And that's a good way of studying philosophy, but I think there's a better way, namely having the historical context in flow and analyzing those arguments and understanding what the particulars are, maybe of classical realists versus analytic philosophy. Now, the second series that I want to look at, which will help us go through this broad topic in the history of philosophy, is one known as the Great Book Series. And I have one of the volumes here, but it's a 60-volume series of the primary resources of the top literature in the history of philosophy, but also with history in general, the primary literature of Western philosophy slash Western literature, of issues related to science, politics, and much more. What it is it is a great books approach of the primary resources from each of the major disciplines that have affected Western ideas. Now, probably the two most important volumes are what are known as the Syntopicon, volumes 1 and 2, where there are 100 articles to talk about the top 100 issues in the history of ideas. And what they do is they give this full summary of the topic, and then they give a bibliography at the end. But here's the key. Not only are you getting the full overview, but in the bibliography and the references, it goes through the other 58 volumes, and it gives you the references that it used in that article on that topic. So you have an overview with a bibliography and references to the original sources and the original quote. It is a research goldmine, and I recommend that you purchase it like immediately. It's one of the best series that you can ever use for education in general. In fact, if you were to just read through that with a modicum of understanding, you would probably have a better education for the cost of that series than you would from a 4-year university. So again, Copelson's 9-volume history of philosophy and the Great Book Series. With that aside, we're going to jump into the big topics here. So we must start with where, in many respects, philosophy started, in ancient Greece, in the ancient philosophers. There are a variety of people that you can read, but you need to become intimately familiar with Socrates, probably the greatest philosopher of Western philosophy. Namely, it starts with Socrates, and in many respects, nobody has been able to defeat this old gadfly, as they might say. Now, a lot of the works of Socrates are found in Plato. In fact, pretty much all the works are found in Plato. And what you're going to do is you go through here, and Plato has a whole series of what are known as dialogues, which are these, like they say, conversations or dialogues on these key issues. And one figure has said this: the history of philosophy is nothing more than a series of footnotes on Plato, how you add to him, subtract to him, detract from him, maybe modify him in some way, shape, or form. And like I said, we have that whole series on the footnotes on Plato if you want to know that in greater detail. But the main books that you should read from Plato are his Republic, the Meno, Euthyphro, Apology, Credo, Phaedo, and Gorgia. Now, let's start out here with the Republic, just very briefly. I just only want to talk about this one. Let's just figure we were sitting around and one day we said, hey, let's make a town. Why not? And then we start asking, well, what kind of government should it have? What kind of teachers should we have? Should we allow philosophers? Should we have kings? Should we have musicians and artists? Should we have these different figures? What do we do with poor people? How do we discipline people? You might be thinking to yourself, those things are all really important. And if we're going to make a society, we would need to answer those types of questions. Well, in many respects, that's Plato's Republic. Plato is trying to build the Republic, and he's offering his full defense on what the ideal society should look like. And he's giving us his whole ideal of the philosopher king and how discipline operates and how music should or should not function and the way artists should function and how we should raise children and so much more. But some of the other works that you can look at with Plato, like I said, are the Meno, the Euthyphro, the Apology. In fact, I would go with the Apology and the Republic, because in the Apology, you see in many respects how Socrates started out this journey in the history of philosophy. So again, the primary figure that you should read from ancient philosophy is Plato. Now, the second author that you should read is Aristotle. And we're just going to continue going through here, the Great Book Series, all marked in red if you actually purchase it. And the top works that you should look at from Aristotle would be things like his Metaphysics, his Ethics, and his Logic books. And the reason for it is that within Aristotle, you're going to see how he is a footnote on Plato, where he starts to modify and change many of his theses that are found in Plato. Because in doing this, you're going to see Plato was, in many respects, the great idealist of ancient philosophy, whereas Aristotle was the great empiricist of ancient philosophy. And as we look at this, Socrates was the teacher of Plato, and Plato was the teacher of Aristotle. So, in this regard, the key works that you would want to get from ancient philosophy would be the works of Plato, namely the Republic, and maybe the Apology to start out with, and the other ones I listed. And then with Aristotle, you want to pick up his metaphysics, his logic, and his Nicomachean ethics. Starting with those will give you a good understanding of how they say reality exists, namely what is reality, metaphysics in that sense, and their epistemology, how we come to know, and how then shall we live, their ethics, the three top questions people are looking at in the history of philosophy. As we continue along here, we jump ahead into some other philosophers, and some of the big ones that you're going to find as you are in sort of late ancient philosophy or even early sort of medieval philosophy are going to come from figures like Marcus Aurelius and the rise of Stoicism. And the works that he put out during this time period were, in many respects, let me just pull up here some of his top ones here, the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. The second one that you want to look at would be Plotinus's Six Ennead. Now, these are two vastly different thinkers, but what you're finding is that within Marcus Aurelius, you're getting a philosophy of life, whereas in Plotinus, you're getting a philosophy of being, namely what became known as the rise of Neoplatonism, and how you have different levels of reality and how the demiurges are sort of spirating from one another in that regard. Now, that's a very simplistic overview, but again, this is a footnotes approach to the books you should read in the history of philosophy. So again, if you're going through here and you're going to be reading late ancient into early modern philosophy, Marcus Aurelius's Meditations and Plotinus's Six Ennead. Now, when you come to the height of medieval philosophy, the two great philosophers are Augustine and Aquinas. Augustine was in many respects a Platonist slash Neoplatonist, and Aquinas was an Aristotelian. And when you look at Augustine's major works and you pull them up, he has two primary works that you should read. The first one would be The Confessions, which in many respects is the first autobiographical work, and it's the first philosophical autobiographical work where he charts out his conversion to Christianity and his interactions with these great orators in the Greco-Roman world and the great philosophers of the Greco-Roman world, and how he saw Christianity as the answer to the pertinent questions in philosophy. Namely, at this point, you're going to see the real dialogues on the relationship between faith or revelation and reason. The idea that God has revealed himself, like Christians and the Judeo-Christian religion is claiming, and how it reflects and integrates with reason that was taught with these Greco-Roman philosophers. Now, his second book that I would recommend is The City of God, which in many respects is the first book on a philosophy of history. Because during this time, you see Rome is being sacked and it's falling, and Augustine is trying to answer the question, who was the cause of the fall of Rome? Was it the Christians or somebody else? The Romans were blaming it on the Christians, and Augustine is a great philosophical treatise on the truthfulness of Christianity, and he's answering the question in particular about why it was not Christians who caused the downfall of Rome, but he's ultimately looking at there are two big cities that we have to deal with, the city of God and the city of man. And he's arguing for the pure triumph of the city of God. Now, the next great philosopher from the medieval era is Thomas Aquinas, who was an Aristotelian. Now, he put out two primary works that are of interest to figures. And the first one is his great Summa Theologica. And in the Summa, he is giving us his summary of theology. It's a work on philosophical theology in which he starts with God and goes to man, and then he's going to look at how man can get back to God through a doctrine of salvation. And in this work, he's dealing with many of the pertinent issues that it's going to relate to natural theology and anthropology, our study of man, and ethics. And he's probably one of the chief architects for the great height of scholastic philosophy. So you need to read the Summa Theologica. Now, his second work is an apologetic, a rational defense, in which Aquinas is writing this book to the Muslims or to the Gentiles titled Summa Contra Gentiles. It's a summary against the Gentiles. Because during this time, what we were running into is that Muslims were, in many ways, starting to dominate the academy, but they were using the works of Aristotle to do so, because there was the great Renaissance in Aristotelian thinking. And that work is a great treatise in what it looks like to have a rational defense of the Christian faith. Because remember, both Augustine and Aquinas were Christians in light of the dominant Aristotelian Muslim philosophy of his day. In that sense, it's an apologetic, but it's also a great polemic. So what you're going to find with these two great philosophers is the height of faith and reason during the Middle Ages, in which you're going to see how revelation and reason can harmoniously come together in a great synthesis and a great philosophy. Now, as we jump forward in the history of ideas, we come into modern philosophy. And one of the big debates is, when do we want to sort of date modern philosophy? Do we date it with Francis Bacon and his Novum Organum? Do we start it with René Descartes and his Meditations? Well, let's just do this. For the sake of what we're doing here, you need to read both. You need to read Francis Bacon's Novum Organum, which is giving us the scientific method, which is really an issue relating to philosophy of science. But you're going to see how he starts to detract from the ancient and medieval understandings of philosophy and science, and how that's going to bring us into the modern world of science. But as we continue to look through here, you also find that there are other figures, namely René Descartes and his new method, his scientific philosophical method of doing philosophy. And within René Descartes, you need to read his Discourse on Method, Meditations on First Philosophy, because in that book, what you're going to find is he's giving us a philosophy for the modern scientific figure. And it's because he's interacting with the rise of modern science. And that's why with Bacon, like I said, you need to read Novum Organum. The New Atlantis is another book that you could read. You're going to see this rationalistic, namely from Descartes, you're getting rationalism, but from Francis Bacon, you're getting more empiricism. This rationalistic sort of a priori philosophy in which you're going to see the role of certainty and deduction in modern philosophy. So in this early time period, coming in modern philosophy, Francis Bacon, and you're going to look at René Descartes. But there's one other figure you would want to look at, namely Benedict Spinoza, the great pantheist. And I would recommend you read his work on ethics, because in that you're going to see how he brings together both his metaphysic, epistemology, and philosophy. So we've got these different eras in the history of philosophy. And what it did is it created great angst in people. People were wondering, what's the relationship between faith and reason? Can we have certainty? Are we able to have true knowledge? And one figure that came about was Blaise Pascal and his famous works on the Pensées and his different letters and scientific treatises. But the best work you should read for the history of philosophy would be his great Pensées, where he's looking at the relationship between not man qua philosopher man, but man as man, the mannishness of man, or the humanity of humanity. And he's looking at all of the different letters or issues within his Pensées on how do we have this idea that our hearts are restless until they rest in thee, like Augustine, and he brings that into the modern world. So again, as you're looking at the relationship between modernity and Christianity, look at Pascal's Pensées. Now, as we continue to go along, there are several great philosophers that arose. Some of them wrote political treatises and treatises in epistemology and various others. But the ones that I want to look at here as we continue are Locke, Berkeley, and Hume. And with John Locke, he wrote really treatises related to government and philosophy. And the works for his philosophy on government or philosophy of politics would be something like A Letter Concerning Toleration or Concerning Civil Government. But if you're going to look at some of his stuff related to philosophy, the best work that you can get from him in that would be an essay concerning human understanding. Now, as you look at John Locke, he was the great empiricist of his day, but you find that there is still this other strain and flow in the history of philosophy that comes from idealism. And you find that in George Berkeley and his Principles of Human Knowledge. And you're going to see him in that book, The Principles of Human Knowledge, give us the great idealistic work of his era. Now, there's probably the height of empiricism finds itself in David Hume and his book, An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. And in that work, David Hume gives us the rise of modern skepticism. He's the great Scottish skeptic, the hard skeptic, in which he's trying to answer questions about the consistency of empirical reasoning. So in this, you start to find philosophy is brought into this position of, are we doomed to skepticism? And to answer that came probably the greatest philosopher of modern philosophy, which was Immanuel Kant, the father of agnosticism. Now, Immanuel Kant gave us a variety of different works, but his top works that you should read for the history of philosophy, remember, we're looking at the top books of philosophy, are the Critique of Pure Reason, the Critique of Practical Reason, and the Critique of Judgment. The Critique of Pure Reason is his great treatise on the epistemology of agnosticism. The Critique of Practical Reason would be the ethical implications of that epistemology. But there's also one other book that I would recommend, and it is Religion Within the Bounds or Within the Boundaries of Reason, in which Kant is trying to say, in light of my great philosophy, what does religion look like? And in many respects, he's trying to give us a religion that is synthesized or reconcilable with agnosticism. So those would be the great books coming from Immanuel Kant. As we come out of Immanuel Kant, there are several key thinkers. And you probably see if the tree of philosophy is going to have its branches spread, it goes crazy after Kant. Now, some of the key figures that I would recommend reading would be George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, or just known as Hegel. And he has two great books that you could look at, The Philosophy of Right and his Philosophy of History. Now, what's important with Hegel is you see the rise of what became known as the dialectic, this idea of a thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And it became sort of the foundation for all the different dialectics that were found in, say, a figure like Marx and other big dialectical philosophers. And what he's trying to strive for is this idea of a philosophy of history, but it's also the idea that truth isn't fixed and final. It's trying to evolve towards its sort of utopian ideal. And most people have a difficult time reading Hegel, but in order to understand some of the big philosophers of the 19th and 20th century, you need to see how they either appropriate or modify or sometimes reject this concept of the dialectic. Now, as we continue going through here, another key philosopher and book that you would want to read would be Soren Kierkegaard's book, Fear and Trembling. And in many respects, he's giving us this rise of existentialism, and he's giving us a key treatise on the religious implications of existentialism. Now, another existentialist from a different perspective is Friedrich Nietzsche. Namely, it's an atheistic existentialism, and his book titled Beyond Good and Evil. So again, as we're flowing out of Kant, we see this rise of this sort of critical idealism, and you've got Hegelian thought and his philosophy of history, and existentialists, the two big existentialists, Soren Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling, and Friedrich Nietzsche's book, Beyond Good and Evil. Now, one thing that you're going to see, as we're just going to continue, we're almost done here with Adler's series on this, was the rise of Marx. Now, if you look at this in Adler's series, this is a blue book. So it's actually a different genre because all the philosophy books are in red. But Marx ought to be considered one of the great philosophers because he's bringing together a philosophy of politics or a political philosophy in his great manifesto of the Communist Party, in which you're going to see the dialectic applied to society. As we finish here, what I want you to see is that in the great history of philosophy, there are several fundamental works that you ought to read. And you need to start with the primary resources and not the secondary resources. So what I'm going to ask you to do is join this great conversation, this great history of philosophy. Join with us as we are trying to have these timeless dialogues.